This is a time of fasting, but also of looking forward to the future. And speaking of the future, we are honored and privileged to have Professor David Passig, an Israeli futurist, lecturer, consultant, and best-selling author, all the way from Israel, with us this evening to hear his predictions for the future. Will that future be bright? We will soon find out. Professor Passig is Associate Professor at Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel, where he teaches at the Graduate School of Education. He has served as the Chief Advisor to the Commissioner for Future in the Israeli Knesset. Passig's best-selling books are The Future Code and 2048. Each has received Israel's coveted Gold Book Award. His most recent book, For Cognito, The Future Mind, was published in January 2013 and was at the top of the Israeli bestseller list. His upcoming book is entitled The Future of Judaism, Israel, and World Jewry, 2100. We will hear more about that this evening. Professor Passig holds a PhD in Future Studies from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And I mention that because that is where I am from and where I first met David. His name was mentioned many times fondly at our family's dinner table by my brother Nafton, mentioning what he had learned from him at the Talmud Torah of Minneapolis, where he did a little bit of work while studying for his PhD. The first time I heard David Passig, Professor Passig, speak was in 2005 at Camp Ramah, Wisconsin, where he was a guest scholar, and his son attended summer camp and even attended one of my Jewish studies classes. I was amazed by his predictions and can personally testify that I saw some of those predictions come true in the last 15 years. I'm sure that tonight's lecture will be equally insightful, and I now pass on the Zoom spotlight to our honored guest, Professor David Passig.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a privilege to speak from Israel with the heat wave now, and I see that you are all with some winter kind of outfit. But what I would like to share with you tonight is some thoughts that might be kind of revealing our time in history. This is actually just an attempt to understand the future. I hope you understand that no one can even say that he has the ability to foresee what really will happen in the 21st century, but we are going to try at least. Now, let me start by introducing you a little bit to the idea behind future studies. Otherwise, whatever I'm going to speak about, you'll think it's coming from my guts, and that's not exactly the impression I would like to leave with you here. This field, or this discipline, is called future studies because there are infinite futures. There is no one single future. What we are trying to do is to lay out those possibilities and give those possibilities some let's say, validity in order to see which of those possibilities might be realized and might have some impact on our lives. So the idea is, of course, that we're trying to clarify part of what might happen. We cannot scan all the possibilities, so we concentrate on those that looks like very, very important to all of us, and of course, very possible that they will at the end be realized. How we do it exactly? Well, this discipline is just a branch of a different discipline in academia, which is called the systems thinking. We are systems thinkers, and the idea behind the future studies is that there is or the main assumption is that there is logic how systems are evolving. When we accept that assumption, then we start looking at the logics that are hidden behind different kinds of systems, be it economical systems or geopolitical systems or technological systems, etc. And with that insight about how systems are evolving, we just project it into the future, what we call the vectors of our systems. And this is basically what we call futures thinking. Okay, let me clarify before I start that global trends of the 21st century are going to be very different than the mega trends that are going to shape Judaism generally, and very specifically the Israeli community. Not only those trends are going to be different, but they are going to be exactly the opposite of what we're going to see worldwide. And I'm going to give you just a sense, briefly, a sense of the mega trends that are going to shape humanity in the 21st century, and then I'm going to reflect them specifically to the Jewish people and to Judaism. Okay, I would like you to remember this term. We call it now the global demographic winter. And I'm going to give you a very large perspective of the demographics of the 21st century. First of all, the global one, and then we'll see how it is being reflected within the Jewish people. And just remember that we are exactly the opposite of what we are going to see worldwide. Let me take you back 12,000 years in time. Okay, as much as we understand or we know, about 10,000 BC, there were on this planet around 1 million or at best 5 million people. By the way, about 60,000 years back, on this planet there were about 10,000 humankind like you and me, the Homo sapiens. And bit by bit, humanity has grown, developed. There were time after time, humanity lost people from pandemics, etc., and we knew that another pandemic is around the corner. So a lot of people are really amazed that such a thing is happening in the 21st century. But from our point of view, it was obvious that it is coming. It's either in the third decade of the 21st century or as far as we could have imagined it could not be far away than the third decade of the 21st century. And bit by bit, humanity has developed. We tend to say now that around 2,000 years ago, humanity reached the 250 million mark. But when we reached that figure, humanity started developing in an amazing pace. Take a look what happened just in a matter of about 1,800 years. We quadrupled our societies. We reached the 1 billion mark. But when we reached the 1 billion mark, take a look what happened. It took us only 130 years to double that figure. And then it took us only 30 years to add another billion people. And then only 15 years, another billion people. And then in just 12 years, another billion. And you see how humanity has developed in an exponential way during the last at least 200 years. Nowadays, we tend to say that there are worldwide about 7.8 billion people. We tend to add to that number at least another 200 or 300 million people that are not accounted. And in different places, they are termed differently. Like in the US, they are termed the undocumented population, etc., etc. However, the idea is to try to understand how many people will be worldwide by the year 2050. And at least at this point of view, with the reliability of more than 85%, most of the experts are saying that by 2050, humanity will reach around 10 billion people. However, in the second half of this 21st century, something unusual is going to happen, and that's why we call it the global demographic winter. Something unusual, and a lot of people are trying to understand it at this point. I'm going to show you the highest estimate and the lowest estimate of the world population that will be by the end of the 21st century. Take a look. Okay, at best, humanity is going to add another billion people, which means, by all means, we stopped developing or at least adding more population. And there is even a possibility that we will slide back to 6, 7 billion people. And if we will be attentive to this trend, the idea is to do something in the next 30 years so that by 2050 we will not start sliding in a very fast way, but we will do it gradually and we'll reach hopefully the end of the 21st century with something like 8 billion people, which will be exactly as we have started something in the 21st century. Now, this is huge. This is what we call the mega trend that everything derives from it, from world conflicts to technologies. Everything really is derived from it. Now we have a list of 10 reasons why this mega trend is in the making, behind the scene most of the time. I'm going just to share with you one or two reasons. I don't have time to elaborate. One of them is very crucial. At this point of time, in human history, as far as we know, exactly the opposite of what happened during millennia. For every 100 females, there are already 117 males up to the age of 19, which is mind-boggling. We really don't have an exact idea how is it that this is what's happening at this point of time. But of course, there are some explanations, but they are not complete. One of them is, of course, education of females. I'll give you just one that most of us are not cannot even think about it. What we found is that during millennia, there were more miscarriages of boys than girls. Somehow, it's hard to conceive or to bring males to the end of pregnancy. So during millennia, there were more females that were born, and that's why probably some of the traditions and cultures has developed that tradition to marry more than one female. Nobody would like to leave them by themselves. So this is only one reason, and there are many other reasons, but this reason is very crucial. Okay, there are a lot of consequences. What does it mean that 17% of humanity by the year 2050 will be more males than females? Okay, that this is something that we don't have anything from the past to really understand its large impact. So in Israel, if you see, it's in different countries, it's a different figure. In Israel, what you see is that already we have 5% more males than females up to the year 19 years old. But take a look at this one, okay? This is what we call Jordan, okay? They have already 6 more percent. But take a look at this one, which makes something unusual in this region. There are 20 more percent males than females in Saudi Arabia, for example. And that brings a lot of tension, a lot of outcomes in different fields. A lot of people are trying to understand how it's working in different areas, but I'll give you just one sense of how things are evolving. For example, as you are all familiar with, there are a lot of religious schools all over the Muslim world. And one of the reasons is that there are many more boys than girls. And this is a frightening energy of different rulers. And one of the ways to somehow control or maneuver that energy is to put that energy on religious schools and ask religious scholars to bring down that energy so that at least they will not come or raise against the rulers. But this is just one idea how by understanding demography, we can understand other phenomena in society, in technology, etc., etc. Okay, let's go to the Jewish people. Now, this is really, in a nutshell, something that is much huge, and we don't have time to elaborate. But let's see how it is being reflected within the Jewish people. Again, let's take a very large perspective. About 3,000 years ago, exactly the time of King David, as far as we know, there were in Israel around 300,000 at the time were called Hebrews. We started being named the Jews only after the destruction of the first temple. And for millennia, the Jewish population barely accumulated. Around 700 years ago, a very important time in our history, which is called the Golden Era in Spain, as far as we know, there were worldwide about 1 million Jews only, okay? And by the way, out of those million Jews, about 70% resided in Spain. And that's why probably Spain was a golden time in Jewish history. And everybody was actually moving over there. That was, if you wish, Manhattan of the time. Okay, and then, of course, 500 years ago, there was the Spanish expulsion, and around 300,000 Jews were expelled from Spain. The other 400,000 Jews just assimilated. And bit by bit, barely the Jewish people recovered also from that expulsion. And about 200 years ago, as far again as we know, because nobody was able at the time to count people, but these are just estimates. About 200 years ago, the Jewish people reached worldwide about 3 million people. And then something unusual happened. In a matter of only 140 years, before World War II, Judaism or the Jewish people reached an amazing figure in its history. It was not, never such a figure had been in our past. We reached about 17 to 18 million Jews worldwide. Out of those 18 million Jews, 12 million Jews resided in Europe, and the rest were scattered all over. Of course, we have reached a point that very, very important crisis in our history, what we call now the Holocaust. And as far as we know, we just started recovering from that crisis, because only in 2019, we reached back the 14.8 million Jews worldwide, which means we've just started recovering from the Holocaust. By the way, if you really want to understand our time in history, bear in mind those two figures. The first is how many Jews would have been at this point in time if the Holocaust would have been happened. And of course, and Israel would have been established. So if there was no Holocaust and there was a Jewish state, how many Jews would have been at this point in time in history? There are a lot of estimates, but most of the experts agree that probably we would have been at this point something around 34 million Jews worldwide. This is huge. This is something heavy on our subconsciousness. And there are a lot of implications to this subconsciousness figure, if you wish. The other figure I would like you to bear in mind is the next one. Okay, how many Jews would have been now worldwide if the Holocaust would have happened and the Israeli state would not have been established? So if there was a Holocaust and there was no Jewish state, this is what most of us think would have been at this point of time in history, around 6, at best 7 million Jews worldwide. So Israel is a savior of Jewish history in our epoch, by all means. And we have to put it in mind because something unusual is in the making. I would like to share it with you in the next slide. So how many Jews are now worldwide? We've said we are about 14.8 million, but for the first time after 2,600 years from the destruction of the first temple, the largest Jewish community resides now in Israel. We are about 6.8 million Jews in Israel, about 75% of the Israeli society. Okay, the Israeli society, we are now around 9.2 million Jews. So this is a threshold in Jewish history. For the first time after 2,600 years, the largest Jewish community resides in Israel. It has to have an impact on history. And I would like to a little bit understand what kind of impact it's going to have on Jewish history. Okay. Now, if you wish to see how the Jewish communities are scattered over the world, these are the last numbers. The largest Jewish community now after Israel is, of course, the US. They used to be for many, many years more than 6 million Jews. Now there are barely 6 million Jews, and the Israeli, of course, community is 6.8 million Jews. The next one is France, and Canada, and Australia. If I'm not mistaken, we are there only around 100 and 110,000 Jews on total. But what I would like to understand is how many Jews would be worldwide by 2050. A very interesting point of time, a landmark in world population, and I would like to understand how many will be worldwide Jews, and out of that number, how many will reside in Israel. So this is what we understand at this point of time, with something like an 85% reliability, which is huge in our terms of futurist thinking. This is what we think. Okay, we are probably going the only country worldwide that is going to double its population, almost double its population by 2050. But what I would like you to take a look at is that Judaism, or the Jewish people, is going to recover from the Holocaust a century after the Holocaust, and they get back to the 18 million mark. But something really is different. Before World War II, there were 18 million Jews worldwide. And out of those 18 million, 12 million were in Europe. A century on, only a century after that, 18 million Jews again worldwide, but 12 million Jews will reside in Israel. And it's going to be really something unusual. We're speaking about 65% of world Jewry is going to reside in Israel. By the way, as far as we know, even during the first temple, the era of the first temple with Solomon and King David, not all the Jews resided in Israel. A lot of Jews resided in Egypt, a lot of Jews resided in Babylon and in Rome, what became later on in Rome. And this is probably going to be the first time in history that the majority of the Jews are going to reside in Israel. This is 2050, but I'm much more interested how many Jews will be worldwide by the end of the 21st century, and out of those that figure, how many of them will reside in Israel. And this is what the UN is speaking about. Okay, I'm going to show you what the Israelis are speaking about. The UN are speaking about that by the end of the 21st century, there will be about 24 million Jews worldwide. Out of those 24 million Jews worldwide, there will be 20 million Jews in Israel and 4 million minorities in Israel. So, first of all, Israel is going to triple its population in 21st century, while most of the world, most of the nations worldwide are going to slide back and lose population. And this is going to make Israel very different, with different kinds of challenges. I don't have to explain those challenges, but just think about that the Israelis or the Statistics Bureau of Israel is speaking that we will reach that figure by the year 2060 or 65 already, not by the end of the 21st century. And just think about the challenges of building two more countries in a matter of 80 years. There are huge challenges around it, and of course, a lot of opportunities. This is, generally speaking, the background of something much more important that is in the making. Because what does it mean? What kind of society, what kind of narrative, what kind of characteristics the Jews are going to develop because of this trend? And this is what we are trying very hard in the last few years to study, the impact of this trend on all of us. By the way, if you can see, there are a lot of nations that are losing population, and Israel is really picking more and more populate up to the end of the 21st century, and after that, probably we will even shrink during a few decades. But this is what we think at this point, and I'm not going to discuss the 22nd century. 21st century is enough challenging to think about. Okay, so of course, as I said, it's a great challenge. In a matter of 8 years, we'll have to build 2 more countries in this very small piece of land, and it needs to be much more advanced, and it needs to be, of course, much more technologically driven, and all what you can even think about that is missing now from Israel. Okay, now let's go to one of the greatest impact of this trend on our history. How Judaism itself is going to change because of this mega trend. And it is going to change. We probably have crossed a threshold in Jewish history. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit about that threshold. I'm going to take a few ideas in order to be able to explain what I mean by that threshold. Okay, most of the time in our history, we lived in that feeling of existence on the brink of precipice. This is almost part of being Jewish in the last at least 2 millennia. And I would like to pick up on an analogy that was written in one of the classics in the last few centuries. It's the story of Octavia that you are all familiar about, that Marco Polo has spoken about with the Mongolian Caesar. And when the Mongolian king asked Marco Polo, "Where are you coming from?" Marco Polo is speaking and delivering a very interesting analogy. He says to him, "I'm coming from a city called Octavia. And that city is hung on the air, and what people in that city are constantly doing is only taking care of the chains or the nets upon which that city is hung in the air, so that that city will not collapse and everybody will lose their life." And this analogy actually explains humanity's existential feeling of in our daily life. What we are doing constantly, we are just taking care so that we will have a roof above our head, we will have enough monies in order to take care of our kids. We are constantly taking care so that we will not collapse to the ground. I'm going to pick up this idea and use it in order to explain the existential feelings that Judaism is having at this point of time in history, and how that feeling is going to develop the more we progress in time in the 21st century. Okay. By the way, if you are not aware of, there is such a city in Spain. It's called Ronda, and it's an amazing place to see. But everything is, above on the air, and from time to time, even people are losing food and finding themselves down the streams, if you wish. So, what I would like to do is to take this analogy and say that Judaism, generally speaking, in the last at least 2,600 years from the destruction of the first temple, Judaism has been feeling that existence at the brink of collapsing, and what used to hold our identity or our entity is a spider of 4 types, if you wish, of ropes, okay, upon which we have put our feet during at least the last 2 millennia. Okay, I'm going to a little bit clarify what kind of ropes, if you wish, used to be our social net, if you wish, or existential net, if you wish. The first rope was the rope that emphasized Jewish religion as the most important aspect of our existence. And a lot of people said that if you do not put your feet on that halachic foundation, if you wish, then your prospects to keep being Jewish are minimal, and probably you will not continue being Jewish, or at least your offspring will not continue being Jewish. This is the first huge or large rope on which a lot of people are basing their identity. The other one is saying that, no, it's not a halachic rope, it's not a halachic foundation, but more an ethnic kind of entity. And only if you put your foot on that entity or that foundation, then you will have more chances of surviving the calamities of time and, of course, of Jewish history. The third rope speaks about a kind of Hebrew mindset. Okay, we were Hebrews, speaking Hebrew. It's like saying Anglo-Saxons, Francophones. We are based upon our language, and that language has can mold our entity, our identity, our way of thinking, our way of our contribution to humankind, etc., etc. And the fourth rope emphasizes more the nationality of our existence. This is a little bit more modern in our history because, of course, of Israel. But those four ropes are the main ropes that during millennia were together, bound together. But what happened in the last 200 years is that a huge rope that used to have four kind of ropes has bit by bit diminished, and what we see now is that there are four very distinctive foundations upon which different people, different Jews worldwide in Israel are willing to base their foundation. Now, for millennia, we used to be either on one rope or live totally Judaism. Okay, and during millennia, most of the time, Jews were living Judaism. Just for very few times in which Judaism has received and attracted people from the outside. We are actually at this point in time on another era in which we are attracting also people from outside of the religion or the ethnic group, if you wish. So what happened now is that we came to a point in which we cannot anymore bring those four ropes to bind together to form a very solid rope on which we can all base the foundation of our identity, or in our, if you wish, national and religious entity. And this is a huge challenge because that's probably what's behind a lot of difficulties, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of different ideas. The person that elaborated on this theory is called Abuluf. Abuluf is a scholar now in Tel Aviv University. This is his PhD dissertation. And what he found is that at least in the last 120 years, the debates within the Zionist movement and world Jewry was upon which of those ropes we will have to found the Jewish state. And what he found is that during 120 years, there are only debates, and we did not and we could not come to a conclusion which of those four foundations is the most promising, so that we will continue to survive the challenges of time and history. And upon this theory, what I would like to say is the following, okay? I would like to say that something is in the making behind the scene in Israel and worldwide, and it's going to shape upon which of those foundations we are going to base and found the Jewish identity and Jewish entity and narrative in the 21st century. Let me share with you a very interesting study that was concluded a couple years ago, and there is a book if you wish to elaborate upon it. And that book, two scholars try to understand how the Israeli Jewish population is scattered in their ideas about what should be a Jewish state, not just a state for Jews, but what should be a Jewish state. Without understanding it or knowing it, what they found is that the Israeli society is divided in those four foundations. And that's what is bringing a lot of tension among different groups in Israel regarding what kind of halacha it needs to be, in public areas, or what kind of juridical halachic ideas needs to be embedded within the social and general juridical ideas, etc., etc. And let me show you something really amazing. For up to a couple of years ago, what we thought is that the Israeli community is somehow divided as follows. About 30% of Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society, didn't want any Judaism, any kind of Judaism within the Israeli society. They said, if you want to be Jewish, do it in your house, but in the public arena, we should not have any Jewish ideas. Okay, we should be as any other nation that separates religion and the nation. Okay, about 30%, and we thought that there are about 10 to 15% of the Israeli Jewish community that thought that we need to base or establish a Jewish state, that halacha is a very important foundation of that entity and the national identity, 15%. And in the middle, there were a lot of ideas that you can, see in different places, and it was something that was cohesive. We could not even understand that middle ground of people. Sometimes some of the people in the middle ground, they lean towards that one end, and others on another end, and themselves one time here and one time there. But this study has clarified something unusual that is happening in Jewish history, or at least in Israeli history. Okay, what they found is that there is about 17% of Israeli Jews that are observed Jews and would like to have a, if you wish, a state that is based with a lot of halachic ideas within its national institutes, national narrative, etc., etc. 17%. That's one end. On the other hand, those 30% that we thought don't want any kind of Judaism within the Israeli state, in Israeli nationhood, has been divided into two groups. One group, smaller group, says that they don't want to see anything Jewish within the Israeli nationhood. Okay, they are more kind of a universalist, if you wished. Okay, and they are even against, not just they don't want, but they are against any Jewish narrative or tradition to be part of the Israeli country or the Israeli state. Those 30%, as I said, has been divided into two groups, and there is another group that they call themselves, we are Israelis. We are not universalists. We are Israelis. And they are more emphasizing the nationality of Israel as an ethnic group. The other group, the universalists, they don't want even to see an Israeli ethnic group. They would like to be part of a larger universal entity without boundaries, without nationalities, etc., etc. So that 30% that we thought was cohesive has been divided into two. And the most interesting thing that they have found is that the middle ground is starting to be more and more cohesive. More than 55% of Israeli Jews are observant Jews, traditional Jews. They would like to have some rituals within the Israeli society. They don't want to see a halachic nation, okay? But they would like to infuse as much as possible rituals, ideas, traditions, and even kind of let's say juridical ideas that are not coming from the UK, but that has some base and source within the Jewish canonical literature. Okay, so this is really huge. It's in the making. It explains a lot of things that are happening in Israel. And of course, this group, this largest group, is more and more taking ground and will bring its ideas in the future within the Israeli politics, within a lot of other things in Israel. This is Israel. I'm going to share with you what we have found in the US. I don't have numbers and statistics of Australia, but in the American Jewry, something very different is happening. Okay, the second largest Jewish community, something very different is in the making. The Pew has a couple years ago developed a methodology to scan religiosity within the American society, the general American society. So they have devised a scale of seven stages, if you wish, of religiosity. Okay, and they have studied different religions within the American society. What they found is that there is that bell curve, usual bell curve. The extreme ends are small, and the middle is the biggest group of people. Okay, so there are those that are highly religious, somehow religious, and non-religious. But when they have studied the Jewish people, the Jews within the American society, they have discovered something really unusual. What they have discovered is that the highly religious part is, again, similar to Israel, about 17% of the American Jewry. And at the end, at the middle part, okay, those that in other religions were consisted the largest group of people, they found that that's the smallest group of people. And the end And the other extreme of that scale, they found that about 42% of American Jewry are very solidly secular, and they are not only solidly secular, they are against the Jewish religion, even though they would like to keep their identity as being Jews. They are against the establishment, against the religion, against the ideas, against religion, generally speaking. So this is really a phenomenon that has been discovered just lately, and it explains a lot of things that are happening in the US. So we see that divide that is happening within Jewish institutes and groups and NGOs, and a large group that is against Israel and against institutions, etc., etc. So I don't know exactly what's happening in Australia, but I would urge you to educate me, and or if you don't have any kind of study that describes exactly how the Australian Jewish community is divided, this is the time to do it, even though I suspect that the Australian Jewish community will have a very different kind of ratios, and maybe even it will reflect the Israeli community more than the US community. Okay, so what are the challenges that these huge mega trends are going to have on or to pose in front of the Jewish community worldwide and in Israel? Okay, so the first challenge is that we need somehow to shape a new foundation for the Jewish identity in the 21st century. The foundation upon which Judaism has been based in the last 2 millennia has dissolved, if you wish, into 4 kind of foundations. I don't believe we are able, or we are at the stage that we will be able to bring them together and form back a very solid bond between those 4 groups. I believe that that's it. Nowadays, there are part of us that are standing on one foundation, and they believe 100% that whoever stands on another kind of foundation will bring disaster to the continuity of the Jewish people and the continuity of the Jewish state. So we are at a stage in Jewish history that we need to form something new, okay? And by the way, it can be done. We did it not once and not twice in our history. And I'll come to it in a few minutes. If you wish, I can explain it in a very different way. Okay, we call it the raison d'être of our existence as a religion, as a nation, etc. Okay, now if we can divide it into 2 main paradigms, I would take Rabbi Soloveitchik idea and have it and apply it to the nationhood identity. Okay, what we say is that the Jewish state, specifically Israel, was the project Judaism in the last 120 years. This is the most important project. At the beginning, very few were believed that such a project is even has any prospects. But 120 years later, and 72 years after the establishment of Israel, it's clear to everybody now, almost everybody, not everybody, it's clear that that project was crucial in the 21st century, and it was a savior by all means. But the Jewish state, or Israel, was based on a covenant of faith from the past. What the Jewish people, or the groups that formed the Jewish people during the last 120 years did is the following. They said, let's forget what kind of a Jewish state we would like to establish. Let's first establish a homeland that will cut that vicious cycle of terrible fate that we have experienced, at least in the last 2 millennia. Okay, so the idea was, first of all, to bring the different kinds of groups to forget their vision about what kind of a Jewish state we would like to establish, but first of all, to establish a place that will be safe enough so that others will not continue slaughtering us again and again. So we call it the covenant faith aspect of our national and not just national, but global entity in the 20th century. We are not the only nation that was formed based on a covenant of faith. There are different nations, okay, like the US, like France, like other places, and Australia also. But what we found is that it takes about 4 generations until the glue of that covenant dissipates. This is not an infinite glue. It's the really temporal glue. After about 3 to 4 generations, that glue starts dissipating, and the groups that formed that covenant starts thinking about, okay, now we have a safe homeland that is safe physically to be there, but we need to start thinking, okay, what kind of what we call a future we would like to see in that nation? What kind of rationale? What kind of idea? What kind of identity we would like to see being established? And in that phase, that the glue starts dissipating, we see in different places. We see assassinations of leaders, and at the end also there is even civil wars that are happening. Okay, in the US we have seen it, in France we have seen it, and only after a crisis in which groups are collapsing on each other, there is a new kind of thinking that is arising that says, okay, now we need to establish a covenant of destiny, which means we need to pick up an idea around which we will form new institutes, we will form our future identity, we will form our raison d'etre as a nation, as a group of people in history. Now, as I said, different nations did that kind of procedure, if you wish, and I'll give you just one example. The US established that covenant of future ideas around towards, it needs to be basically towards that condense in them a lot of philosophies. Okay, in the US, they established what we call the personal freedom. In France, they established liberté, égalité, and fraternité. The EU is also now engaged in bringing together different nations, different ideas, and they need to establish a covenant that will bring together those groups and will be upon which they will build and established new, let's say, European institutes, and they will even engage in wars in order to bring those ideas into place, into human history. And they did not decide still what kind of idea they would like to base their future covenant, but there is one idea that is in the table. They are still debating it, and I hope they will succeed. Otherwise, they will slide back to terrible wars. This is what they call unity in diversity. And the person that suggested this idea was Giscard d'Estaing, the former French president, but still people are debating it. And we're going to see ups and downs in a process to establish a new idea that will bring together 20 and some countries, European countries, together to form one cohesive entity for the 21st century and 22nd century. So one challenge that is in front of us as a nation is what kind of idea we need to draft that will bring together different kinds of groups with different kinds of visions, with different kinds of ideas about what kind of a Jewish state we need to establish now. Because we have reached already a point in time that we cannot continue by saying that Israel is a place just for the Jews. That's not enough. Okay, by the way, this is part of the conflict between us and between our neighbors. They are actually saying we are not a group that has a nationality. We are a religion. And like in Europe, for example, there are Catholic French and Catholic Germans, and they go in war with each other. The nationality is having a higher priority in their identity and their entity. So the same thing, the Palestinians, for example, and they are writing it very clearly. They are claiming that we are just a religion. We are not a nation. And there's, like Christianity, there are French Jews and American Jews and Australian Jews, and they don't need a nation to establish their entity. Okay, and they are challenging our understanding of ourselves. Okay, so in order to tackle that challenge, we need to actually form an idea that will be something that will be easy to communicate with the world and say, we have a raison d'etre, not only to be a religion, but to be also a nationhood. And this is a huge challenge that is in front of Judaism in general. And we need to bring all our energies and bring all our knowledge from the past. We need to start to form something new. Zionism was a huge idea that was the project of Judaism in the 20th century. I believe this is the project of world Jewry during the 21st century, because if we will not be able to form a new covenant of faith, of future faith, then we will experience more and more assassinations of leaders. We will experience even civil wars, from which we will, at the end, we will resolve. We will come up much stronger, but we will have to go through through that phase, and nobody would like to see such a thing happening in our history. This is one thing. I've been discussing this idea, this challenge with a lot of groups, but I came up with just a suggestion that I lay out in my coming book in order to just show what we need to do as an example. But I don't have time to elaborate. It's something that resonates very well with our canonical literature, with our ideas, biblical ideas, that resonates very well with new sciences of the 21st.
With Dr. David Passig. Hopefully we'll be able to get him back. Otherwise, there were some questions that came in. I was hoping that he would be able to answer them directly. I think we may have lost his connection, but I think the thrust of what he's been talking about is really quite profound. And I wish, like I said, we're working very hard to see if we can get him back online. In the meantime, I can start by the questions that came in. There's a few of the similar ones. The population prediction, why I think the analysis of physical constraint of Israel's geography poses for population growth. Sorry, speaking to the mic. It's usually not my problem. But like I said, hopefully we'll be able to get back. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone. We said earlier at the beginning, to able to focus merely onto the future at this moment now. But as we've learned anything from our tradition, it is rooted in the past, but it anchors us so we can blaze our way forward to the future. So hopefully has been addressing. Oh, and there he is back again.
I'm back, yeah.
Thank you very much. We hear you?
All right.
All right. So
do you hear me?
Wondering if
do you hear me now?
Questions that have come through. If you go to the Q&A section, do you see where?
Let me finish 2 more minutes, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Okay?
Okay. 2
Can
more
I?
minutes. I'm putting my
All right. Okay. Fine. So the idea is that we need to bring something into the philosophy of Judaism. There is another challenge, which is much more crucial. Who are going to be the leaders that will, hold this challenge and take it very seriously? In order to answer this question, I will just briefly speak about a pattern that I have seen in Jewish history. What I found is that up to now there were about 4 phases in Jewish history. Okay, each phase, each era, each epoch consisted of a different narrative, different kinds of authorities, different kinds of leaders, different kinds of ideas, societal and economic ideas, etc. And we are probably at the end of the 4th epoch. We are starting the 5th epoch. And briefly, the first time, the first epoch was what we call the epoch of the forefathers and the foremothers. And those personalities were the leaders, and they were the the authority of almost everything. We learn everything now in the Bible, for example, from those personalities. The second phase was what we call the king's mindset. Okay, that was a very different one. Even though the Bible said, be careful from kings, there was no other way but to establish kingdoms, even though the prophets knew that they will bring havoc to Judaism. And it ended, of course, with the destruction of the first temple. Then came the third phase in our development as an entity and an identity. Okay, that was what we call the priesthood mindset. That was the second temple era, and they've tried also to establish the new form of government and new ideas, etc., etc. But the way in the third phase, for example, we moved from establishing Judaism from fathers to mothers. And there was, of course, a lot of politics around it, etc., etc. The fourth wave, and each era has ended in a catastrophe, okay? And the fourth era, of course, after the destruction of the second temple, was the era of the rabbinical era. All our canonical literature has been developed in the 3rd century, the 4th century, etc., etc. Of course, what we call the Talmudic era. And we are probably at the end of the 4th era, when we are now at the beginning of the 4th era. And what I have found is that there is a pattern of leadership here. That might explain or indicate what kind of leaders are going to take the challenge of establishing the next level of development in Jewish history. What I found is that on each era there were a few groups that claimed to be the leading elite, and there was always a group that was, secondary and that it could not take the leadership role. So during the forefather era, the king's kind of thinking were put aside. In the king's era, the priests were put aside in their ability.
He's going again. I do apologize. I want to thank everyone for their time committing the evening to learning a little bit, studying a little bit, seeing where we may be going, the challenges that may be upon us as a Jewish people, whether we are going to be thriving and surviving. I know there's some more of the questions. We'll do our utmost. Perhaps we can get him to answer some of these in writing and email out to if you registered. You will hopefully get a response to those. But again, I want to thank all of you for participating, specifically all the different communities, all the people who were able to help put this evening together. I want to thank everyone. I wish everyone a meaningful fast and have a wonderful evening. Laila Tov. Tzum Kal.